So I want to discuss MIDI, what it is, what you can do with it. So we're going to look at what MIDI actually is, what a MIDI controller is, some basic MIDI computer settings, MIDI ports and channels, MIDI thru, and I'm going to show you how I use CC messages to control my synths and how I send out MIDI clock. So like MIDI is a standard which all companies agreed to use, and it basically means that all hardware instruments and computers and stuff, music programs, they can all talk to each other using MIDI. It's a digital signal or language that's used to send musical note information. This is the kind of thing I started with. This is the Roland A49 MIDI keyboard. But essentially it is just a USB MIDI keyboard that you plug in and you can control your soft synths or whatever, or your software instruments. But that's not the only thing you can do with it. You can also plug this into a hardware synth and use this to play that synth instead of the keyboard it's got. Or in some cases, if you have a rack synth that doesn't have a keyboard, then you would require one of these. If you've never used a MIDI keyboard before, the thing to note is that this doesn't have any sounds. This is literally a controller. This is just a keyboard. You use this to plug into something that has sounds, like a synthesizer or your computer instruments, and you use this to play that. So this is purely what's known as a controller, as it's just used to control another instrument. It doesn't have any sounds, it's just sending out note information. So this diagram illustrates every basic MIDI setup. You have a controller that sends MIDI out and instruments receive on MIDI in. And you can also use MIDI thru to chain instruments, but more on that later. And a controller doesn't have to be just a controller keyboard, it could be any instrument with a MIDI out. So this Akai MPK Mini, this is also a MIDI controller keyboard. So this literally plugs in through USB, through the mess of cables I've got, into your computer, and then it allows you to control things. Okay, so every operating system is going to have some MIDI settings. So I'm on a Mac here, and on Mac you have an app called Audio MIDI Setup. So if we go into that, now this is all the audio stuff. So this will show you any devices you've got in your computer, but we want to look at the MIDI stuff. So you go Window, Show MIDI Studio. Okay, so this shows you all the MIDI devices that are plugged into your computer or have been plugged into your computer and whether they're active or not. So the micro light, I've got that plugged in, that's a MIDI interface, and that's got 5 MIDI ports, and you can see the 5 ports there, and that's lit up because that's plugged in. But you can see I've got the MPK Mini, that's actually not plugged in right now. And you can see there's a bunch of other stuff as well that's not plugged in, like the Moog Sub Fati, the Minlog XD, and my A series keyboard, which I showed earlier. So if you're having problems with the MIDI not coming through to your DAW, then you may need to check that your computer is actually seeing the device and it's active. I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll plug in my MPK Mini to demonstrate, and then we should see it light up, hopefully. Okay, so I've just plugged in my MPK Mini. If you give it a second, there we go, it's just lit up. For the most part, you won't need to touch anything else in here. You just need to see that it's lit up when you've plugged it in, and then you know your computer recognizes it. So then you can go to the software. So once you know the MIDI is coming into your computer, you've installed all the drivers for your particular controller, and you know it's working on your computer, you're going to want to use that in your music program, your DAW. I'm using Studio One here. So every program will have MIDI settings. So if you go if you find the settings, so here it's preferences, and then if we look at the preferences, if you can see here, we've got external devices. So this is the MIDI area, and you can, that's pretty obvious because it's got the 5-pin MIDI symbol. And here you can set up a device. So if I wanted to set one up, I would just click add, and then I can give it a name, and you can tell it what to receive from. So I want to receive from, let's say, the MPK Mini. It's giving me a message it's already in use because obviously I've already set this up. So I'm going to cancel out of there. But essentially, I won't be able to tell you settings for your particular software, but suffice to say, every DAW has MIDI settings and you need to set that up. Once you've got it set up and you know it's available on a MIDI channel, you should then be able to select it as an input. So on this channel, for example, you can see in and it's selected there. Once you've set it up, MPK Mini, there it is. So then I play and you can see I'm getting a signal now. So an easy way to know whether your hardware or device has MIDI is just to check if it has any MIDI ports. So here I've got the Volca Beats and we can see there's a MIDI import here. So this can receive MIDI, but because it's only got the MIDI import, it can't send out MIDI because it would need MIDI out to do that. If we look at the JU06 again, this actually has MIDI in and MIDI out. So not only can this receive MIDI, but it can also send MIDI out. So this has a sequencer built in, so that means that I could send out the notes from this sequencer to another synth if I wanted. So essentially meaning that I've now got a sequencer that I could use to sequence something else. So you need to be aware of MIDI channels. So out of each physical port, there are 16 channels. And whatever channel you're sending out on, your instrument that you're sending to needs to receive on that same channel or it will not work. So you need to find out where the setting is for this on your synth or your computer to make sure you know what channel you're actually on, so that's not a problem. Okay, so what I want to show you here is I've got the Minilog XD and I've got the a cable coming out of the MIDI output and I'm going into the sub fatty into the MIDI in. So what this allows me to do is play the Moog with the Minilog XD. So if we look at the Minilog XD, you can see the volume's all the way down, and if you look at the MIDI indicator there, you can see that it's been triggered every time I play the Minilog. So just to show you another device, this is the Dittox4 looper pedal, and this has MIDI in, but instead of MIDI out, it has a MIDI through. So the difference there is that this is not going to be sending out any MIDI messages, but you can pass MIDI through the device to something else. So if I'm sending MIDI information into here, then I could send additional stuff like note information. Now because this is a loop pedal, it doesn't need to receive note information. This is more for like MIDI clock in this situation. But let's say I want to chain something else after this, that's where MIDI through comes in. It's for chaining other instruments together. So I can connect a cable out of MIDI through, say to a synth, and this will ignore the synth information because it doesn't want to make use of that, it's not a synth, but that information will come through the device and go to the synth, and they will all be synced together and changed. And it makes sense that this doesn't have a MIDI out because it doesn't send any note information or anything like that because it's a loop pedal, it just records loops. Okay, so here I've got an example of a MIDI through setup. So I've got a cable coming into the Ditto loop pedal on the MIDI in, and this is a MIDI through, and the MIDI through is going to the Volca sample. So the controller in this case is actually the computer. So I've basically got a MIDI cable coming from the computer into here. That's sending clock, and all the clock data is coming out of through, being sent through the pedal into Volca sample. So both of them are now receiving clock. So if I press play on the computer, it's also going to send a clock start message. So they should start playing. So there you go, now they've started playing, and that's a loop I already recorded in there. We're only hearing loop 1 as I've turned that down. But you can see that they're synced, and I've only had to use one MIDI channel. So here's what I want to show you. Every synth will have a manual, and in that manual it's going to tell you what the CC numbers are to control different parameters for that synth. So if we take the Minilog XD for example, this is the manual, and right down on page 20 we have this MIDI implementation chart. And you can see right here, these are all your control change messages. Let's have a look down this. So we can see that VCO1 wave / octave / pitch / shape, that is 50, 48, 34 and 36. So let's say I wanted to be able to control the wave from one of my dials on my controller keyboard. I just have to send out the CC message from to 50. So the MPK Mini I've got comes with this software, and if you look here, these are the dials, and you can see that there's your CC message. So this is the CC message this is currently sending out on. And the value ranges from 0 to 127. So that's like 0% to 100%. So 0 would be all the way to the left, and 127 would be all the way to the right. So all I would have to do now is change this to the right number. And then I would upload this program to the MPK Mini. And then the dial should control the thing that I've set it to. I've already set this up a little bit. If we look back at the manual, we can see that the cutoff is 43. So I've already set that up. Now I'm in Studio One, and so I've got the MPK Mini connected by USB, and I've set this up in the settings. Let's have a quick look. You can see Minilog XD here. I've got this set up. This is sending to my MIDI interface, the micro lights coming out on port 2. It's come out of here. So now I can just select it here. Select my channel. It's just on channel 1. You can see I've set up this dial to do the cutoff. So the nice thing about the MPK Mini is you can set up different programs. You can set up 4. So I've got program 2 is my Minilog XD. I think 1's the Prophet 08. So when I'm using the Minilog XD, if I want to control it from here, I've got the ADSR envelope, and I've got filter cutoff, resonance, and I believe I've got LFO rate as well. There's some other MIDI settings which I like to think of as like global MIDI settings. So one of these, for example, would be clock. How do I send MIDI clock out from the door to a loop pedal or anything that would want to receive clock? So I'll show how you do it in Studio One. So how it works in this door, and it will probably be the same in most doors. The settings will look slightly different, but you can always read the manual or look up and see if anyone else has posted how to do this. But in Studio One, you go to the preferences, and you go to the MIDI settings, which is called external devices. What you can do here is you can set up any external device that you've got. In other words, any external MIDI device. So I've got a Motu micro light attached to my computer. It's a USB device, and what that has is 5 MIDI ports on it. So what that allows me to do is it allows me to send
MIDI signals out through that interface. So what is an interface? An interface is basically something that sits between two pieces of technology. So in this case, the microlight is the interface that sits between my computer sending the MIDI signal and my instrument that wants to receive the MIDI. So for example, the Dittox4 loop pedal, that is something that I would send clock to. So in order for this to work in my DAW, I have to tell my DAW, to send these signals out. I have to set this up. So in Studio One, this is exactly what you have to do. You have to set up your external device. So I've already set this one up, and this is port 5 of my microlight. So if I open this up, so I set this particular one up just to send to the microlight, port 5. I'm not looking to receive anything back, that's why that is set to none. But if I click that drop down, you can see I can see all the ports on the microlight. They've all come up here as options. I can even see my A series keyboard. You can see I've got send to. So this is me sending MIDI signals out of my computer. And you can see I'm sending that to port 5. And that's why I've named this setup port 5. Now, here are the MIDI channels. So I can actually choose to send to all MIDI channels, which I'm actually doing. Or I can actually choose certain ones. So for example, the Dittox4 receives on MIDI channel 4, so I could just select 4. What I usually do is port 5, because that's on the front of the microlight, I just use that as my interchangeable port. So I want to send out of all MIDI channels. And then underneath you can see the MIDI clock option. It says send MIDI clock, and I've ticked that. Now, a MIDI clock, that actually gets sent across all the channels. It's not channel specific. You've also got MIDI clock starts. That's the start message that would start a drum machine playing, or the Dittox4, for example, will start playing when you press play in your DAW. So whenever I play my DAW, this is going to be sending clock, because this is set up like this. I don't even have to have a channel sending out on port 5. I just have to have this in here, and this has to be connected. As long as this is connected, it's going to be sending clock out. I don't have to set up a MIDI channel for it, because it's a global thing. That's pretty much it. And then when I press play, it's going to send the clock.
So hopefully I've given you a good understanding of what MIDI is and how you can use it without going too deep. Yeah, thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.